Okay. The economic history of the world is actually surprisingly simple, and it can be summarized in one diagram. What happens is that before 1800, all the way from the original hunter-gatherers, 100,000 BC, up until 1800, there's no evidence of any increase in material living standards. There are fluctuations within this period, but there's no long-run increase, and people stayed at the same living standards through most of human history. And then, around about 1800, there's the Industrial Revolution, which consists of a big increase in the rate of productivity advance within economies. And for successful economies since then, there's been just a steady upwards rise of income per capita. And incomes have risen at between 1% and 2% per year over the last 210 years, meaning that for the rich countries now, places like America or most of Western Europe, incomes per person now are about 10 times higher than they were for the rest of human history. But interestingly, at the same time, there's a group of economies that since the Industrial Revolution seem to have got poorer. And those are the economies primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. And what we actually find is that for these economies, income per capita now is perhaps only 1/3 of the average level in this long pre-industrial era. And so world history then really consists just of these three separate parts. First of all, there's the long period leading up to 1800, which is designated with the name the Malthusian Trap. And I'll explain in a little bit why Malthusian is the name that's given to this era. That's followed by this one event, the Industrial Revolution. And then this modern era, this very brief part of all of human history that we're in now, has been given the name recently the Great Divergence, because it's characterized by this increasing disparity in incomes between the richest societies and the poorest. And that income disparity now, even in a world of increasingly rapid communication, lower cost transportation, is now in the order of 40-1 between the very richest and the very poorest economies in the world. And so it's a great puzzle to economics, why we've entered a world of such increasing divergence. Now, the period here, the Malthusian Trap, is named after the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, who lived from 1766 to 1834 in southern England. He was an English cleric. He actually had a degree in mathematics, though, when he was at university. He took up the clerical occupation simply as a way of making money. And he, in a famous book in 1798, formulated for the first time an understanding of why, through most of human history, incomes had stagnated and had to stagnate. And that book is an essay on the principle of population, as I say, published in 1798. Malthus was a hugely controversial figure in his time, widely vilified, but the doctrines of that book became incorporated and became a key element in what was called classical political economics, which was the school of economics which dominated, at least in the English-speaking world, before the modern era, which started in 1870, when we entered the world of neoclassical economics. And what is ironic about this is that if you look at our diagram here, Malthus's insights turned out to have been correct for all of history up until just exactly the point at which he wrote his book. Because it's just about at that point that we get this break and we actually enter a world where the policy doctrines implied by his book, policy doctrines such as don't give any subsidies to the poor, these doctrines actually became inapplicable. And so it's, again, one of the ironies of history that people lived through this Malthusian era for 100,000 years, mostly without understanding anything about why incomes were so low, and that understanding was achieved just at the point where that era actually ended. The next thing that this diagram raises is a curious and kind of interesting issue of, well, how many events were there in the history of the world? In the book, which is the text for this course, A Farewell to Alms, I argue controversially that there's only actually one event in all of human history that matters. And that event is the Industrial Revolution. And the puzzles then are, well, why did it take 100,000 years for that event to occur? Why didn't it occur 50,000 years earlier? Could it have occurred 100,000 years later? Could we still have been in the Malthusian era had certain circumstances been different? But that's the focus of the book then, is just the explanation of this one vital event, the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of the puzzle then is about, well, what allowed us to escape this previous world? As a footnote, what this implies is that most of the events that people worry about, events as big as the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s, as the depression that's gripping the economy, the world economy at the moment, most of these events really don't matter in this picture of world history. And in fact, once we move to the scale of hundreds of years, the current downturn in the economy will appear as a minor blip on this constant upward march towards prosperity. And so another irony of this history is that most of the things that actually obsess us in our daily lives turn out to be irrelevant from the point of view of this long-run history of the world. Now, this formulation, where there's only one event in world history, is very different from the way most economists and historians think of history. And in fact, most of history has been littered with various revolutions that people have spoken about, written about, and created. On the panel here, we have a list of some of these earlier revolutions that people have discovered. The first great revolution is the Neolithic Revolution, which occurred independently in 7 or 8 different places in the world between 10,000 and 5,000 BC. This revolution was the transition between hunter-gatherer society, where people lived in small bands and subsisted on the animals and plants that they found in nature, towards modern societies with settled agricultural systems and cultivated plots and domesticated animals. The Neolithic Revolution is given enormous importance by archaeologists and anthropologists. It turns out in this interpretation of history in the book here, it actually doesn't show up as a separate event in human history. The reason for that is that we'll see that it doesn't allow people to escape this Malthusian trap. It's a period of somewhat faster technological advance, but when we look at the details of history, that still there was a rate of technological progress in the Neolithic Revolution that's orders of magnitude lower than what we observe in successful economies now. And it's because of that difference that in the book, this is assigned a much subsidiary role. A second revolution that a number of historians have discovered is what's called the Commercial Revolution, which occurred between 1200 and 1700 in Europe. And this was the rise of markets, the rise of long-distance trade, the development of commercial forms, the development of a lot of the institutions that now dominate modern commercial economies. Again, in the book, this really doesn't show up as being an important development because the focus that we're going to have is on the rate of technological advance. And what we'll see again is that the commercial revolution is actually not associated with that break in terms of the fundamental rate of technological advance in economies. A third revolution that people have spoken about is the Protestant Reformation, beginning with Luther in 1517 and the tacking of his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. Again, people have given great importance to this as an element in the development of the modern world. But again, in the book, actually, this doesn't appear. And we'll see that these revolutions are actually simply subsumed into a general process that will occur in the book that's leading up to the Industrial Revolution. And so they're not given any independent status. After the Protestant Reformation, the next great revolution that many people have written books about is the scientific revolution of 1543 to 1700, which began, it's dated in the beginning to Nicholas Copernicus and his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, which for the first time changed cosmology and placed the sun at the center of the universe as opposed to the earth. And associated with scientific inquiry, empirical tests of propositions, and a lot that underpins modern technological advance. Interestingly, though, we'll see again, this just doesn't appear as a separate event in terms of this history of the world. Okay? The fifth revolution that we encounter is the Industrious Revolution of 1600 to 1800. That revolution is one that a historian from UC Berkeley, Jan de Vries, has very recently discovered and written about. And it's associated with a switch from leisure towards work in modern societies. And one of the things that we'll see in the process of this class is that one of the distinctive differences between hunter-gatherer and earlier societies and the world we live in is actually that we work much harder than in these earlier societies. We'll see that there's evidence that the typical hunter-gatherer works 6 hours or less per day, whereas for modern people, even in high-income societies like ours, work inputs, if we count all work activities, including commuting, home repairs, working for yourself, are still at the level of something like 9 hours a day. And one of the kind of interesting features of social development since the Industrial Revolution has actually been that it was possible when these much higher incomes came along that these incomes could have been consumed in the form of much greater amounts of leisure. In economics, leisure is just another good that you can consume along with things like automobiles and houses and domestic appliances. And we have to make a decision. Each of us has 24 hours a day to spend, and we have to allocate that time between the amount we're going to spend on leisure and the amount that we spend producing goods. And one of the interesting features is that since the Industrial Revolution, we have chosen to spend that higher output of goods that was possible in society through greater productivity entirely in the consumption of more material goods. We haven't spent a penny of all of those gains since the Industrial Revolution in the form of taking greater amounts of leisure. And that's, as I say, one of the kind of ironies of world history. But Jan de Vries has argued that an important element in this Industrial Revolution was a preceding Industrious Revolution where we learned to love work. And in his formulation, the way this happens is that in an earlier society, we take a lot of leisure because there simply isn't that much to spend your income on. It's a world of very limited range of goods and very limited consumption possibilities. And that importantly, preceding the Industrial Revolution, is an increase in the possibilities of consumption, part of which were created by the journeys of exploration earlier, which opened up to a world of tropical goods and silks from China, and that this actually then led to a change in people's behavior, a reorientation towards work, and then a later industrial revolution as we learn to love a world of material consumption. The sixth revolution that has been promulgated and formulated by many people is what I've called here a democratic revolution. And it's a feature of the modern world that high-income societies tend also to be democratic societies. Low-income societies tend to be dictatorships, autocracies. High-income societies tend to have democratic rule. It's also a fact that England, the society which first experienced the Industrial Revolution, had a preceding democratic revolution that occurred in the years 1688 to 89, and which is called the Glorious Revolution. It's called the Glorious Revolution because the current English Parliament are the direct successors of the people who took over government in 1688 to 89. And so when you get to name your own revolution, you tend to give it a good name. And what happened in the Glorious Revolution was that up until 1688, in England, there was a division of power between the king and Parliament. All the way from the medieval period, the king essentially got to decide what was spent. And also in foreign policy, the king got to decide who you would fight with and who you would make peace with. And the only thing that Parliament really got to do was to raise the money for the king and to limit the king by limiting his income streams. And so what happened was that as we approached 1688, there's an unhappy conflict which has existed in England for almost 100 years between the Stuart line of kings and Parliament about the king's prerogatives. And that conflict got wound up also in a religious division at this period, where England is a Protestant country, but the later Stuart kings have Catholic sympathies. And so it all boils into rebellion in 1688, where in a very English arrangement, the Parliament invites James II, the king at that time. They invite his daughter, who's married to the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands, to come to England and take over the throne. And James flees. The reason this is a revolution of 1688 to 89 is that the new regime is only installed in 1689. And in that new regime, Parliament became supreme. The royal family in England became the modern royal family, which mainly exists to serve charities, serve at state functions, and perform ceremonies. And that then was a new democratic government, which led to a very stable political structure in Britain in the years leading up to the Industrial Revolution. And many people have seen a congruence between these two events and have wanted to argue that the fundamental change in history is not the Industrial Revolution, but it's actually this earlier democratic revolution and the move towards democratic forms. And that the problem in history then is to explain not the Industrial Revolution directly, but it's to explain why almost all earlier societies were not democracies, and why democratic forms only came to play later in something like 1688 in England, and that this then would inevitably lead to later growth. And so we have this plethora of other revolutions, and the problem that we have to think about is how many revolutions do we need to make the history of the world. That's what I'm going to take up in the next class. Thank you. Okay. Hi, Doug.